Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian, who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and so he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household and entrusted to his care everything he owned.
Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her. "My master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?"
And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even to be with her. One day he went into the house to attend his duties. None of the household servants were inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house.
She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make a sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house."
When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warder.
So the warder put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warder paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did.
Well, kia ora, Grace City. Whether you're here live with us or whether you're joining us online, it's great to be with you as we jump into the second part of this journey through the life of Joseph in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. So if you've got a Bible with you and you want to follow along, we're in Genesis 39 if you have a Bible or a phone that you'd like to use. The name Alexandre Dumas may not mean a lot to you, but in the French-speaking world, he is one of the best-known authors of all time. Even if you've never heard his name or don't recognize it, you will know his best-known story. It is called The Three Musketeers. But he actually wrote a vast array of historical dramas and novels through his lifetime. And one of the others that is less well known than The Three Musketeers, but of a similar style, is called The Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo is the story of a young man by the name of Edmond Dantes. He is the second mate on a merchant ship. He's engaged to be married to a gorgeous woman until his best friend betrays him. And with the help of two accomplices, they set up charges against Edmond Dantes that sees him found guilty of things that he never committed and unjustly imprisoned in a prison island off the coast of France, where he is left and forgotten for years upon years. It's a story of injustice. It's a story of someone being framed for something they never did. It's a story of being imprisoned when someone hadn't actually done the crime. And one of the subplots of The Count of Monte Cristo, the story that's now been made into a number of different movies through the years, one of the sub-themes of the story is, where is God in the story? And that's one of the questions that Edmond Dantes struggles with as he languishes in his prison cell year after year after year, unjustly put into prison for a crime he never committed. And the question that haunts him is, where is God in the midst of this? And that's very much, I think, the question that is boiling under the surface here as we come to Genesis 39. Jonathan introduced us to the beginning of this last week as we launched this MOSAIC series in Genesis 37. Introduced us to the 17-year-old youth from a pretty broken and dysfunctional family. I mean, very few of us probably have been sold into slavery by our brothers. But that's Joseph's story, isn't it? And that's where we were left last week at the end of chapter 37, as we've heard in the readings today on video. At the beginning of Genesis 39, Joseph finds himself in Egypt. He has been bought at the slave yards by one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of his bodyguard, which was a position of trust and esteem within the Egyptian king's court. And so he is sold as a slave to Potiphar, and he lives there in that home, and he slowly ascends through the ranks as he's given more and more responsibility and trust in the household until, as the introduction ends in the first 6 verses, he's in charge of everything in Potiphar's house. He is the main person running now the household of this man. And so the story actually kicks in at the end of verse 6, which in the NIV version of the Bible that I use is actually the start of a new paragraph. The end of verse 6 reads like this: Joseph was well built and handsome. Now, the Bible actually normally doesn't tell us what characters look like. It's quite rare for the Bible to talk about the physical features of someone. So when it does do that, it does it for a significant reason. And in Joseph's case, it's because his good looks are going to get him into trouble. Actually, the 2 words there, well-built and handsome, in the Hebrew language, those 2 words are only combined to describe one other person, and that was his mum. His mum was a woman called Rachel, who his dad Jacob fell in love with. It's here on the screen. And the same words are used to describe her. The first word in the Hebrew language describes the body. The second word describes the face. So describing her, we translate it into English that she had a lovely figure and was beautiful. But then when those same words are used to describe her son Joseph, we translate it this way: he was well built and handsome. So he was a stud. Like, he was seriously good looking. He was the guy, if you're down on the beach somewhere during summer, you went, good night, I wish I looked like that. In fact, here's what's interesting. Archaeologists working away in Egypt have recently uncovered a mosaic that they're not entirely sure, but they think possibly this could be Joseph. Have a look. He looks remarkably like Brad Pitt, so we're not entirely sure what's going on. But the Bible, which generally doesn't tell us what someone looks like, makes a point of it in this story. Joseph was seriously good looking. And that's what causes the problem he's going to face in this chapter. Because in the very next verse, verse 7, if you've got it in front of you, it says, after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph, and she said, come to bed with me. It's only 2 words in the original language. Sleep me. Come me. And it's designed, I think, and written so that we read this as a very demanding, quite lustful kind of demand. And if you drop your eyes down to verse 10 in the story, what you find is that this happens day after day after day. Joseph is subjected to this ongoing sexual temptation of this woman who desperately wants to sleep with this handsome young guy in her household. And he refuses. And verses 8 and 9 are the only spoken words we have from Joseph in this particular chapter of the story. Have a look. He refused, it says. With me in charge, he told her, my master doesn't concern himself with anything in this house. Everything he owns, he's entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against my master? That's what it says, isn't it? No. How could I do such a wicked thing, Joseph says, and sin against God? See, Joseph is remarkable here. He is a 17, 18, we're not entirely sure how many years have gone past here. He could be in his early 20s potentially. But he is a young man who has received the attention of probably an older woman sexually interested in him, and he refuses to budge on his morals. And to be perfectly honest, that's a huge call from him, isn't it? Hormones are raging. A woman really desires him. He's far from home. Mum and dad are going to never know. He could well feel at this point abandoned by God, certainly abandoned by his family. You could almost understand if he throws it all in and says, oh, what the heck? Why don't I indulge and have a bit of fun? But he doesn't. And at the heart of his refusal to this woman is the stunning statement at the end of verse 9. How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? So he's got a profound theological understanding of what sin is really all about. Centuries later, King David, one of the most godly and wonderful kings in the story of the Bible, ends up sinning horribly. He sees a woman in a city bathing by the name of Bathsheba. He orders her brought to the palace. He forces her to sleep with him. He ends up lying about it and trying to cover up his sin. When he finds out she's pregnant, he ends up having her husband murdered in war. It's just a horrible story of a tremendous failure of a character who really does a wonderful job of walking with God through most of his life. And when David was finally confronted by a prophet, he writes a beautiful psalm in the Bible, Psalm 51. It's a stunning prayer of confession about how he's failed God. And in Psalm 51 verse 4, David wrote these words, "Against you, God, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so you're right in your verdict and justified when you judge." Now David's using hyperbole in there. He's using exaggeration because he had sinned against more than just God. He'd sinned against Bathsheba. He'd sinned against his other wives. He'd sinned against Uriah. He'd sinned against the general he got to get Uriah killed in the war. He'd sinned against his people. But what David says is, at the end of the day, the one I have most offended and hurt by my sin is you, God. And that's exactly what Joseph understands here, this remarkable young adult. He says, I cannot do this. And it's not so much it would be a sin against Potiphar, my master, which is true. He says, it would be wrong for God. And so even though this temptation comes day after day after day, Joseph stands firm. And then this climactic day comes in the story in verses 11 and 12. We read, one day, he went into the house to attend to his duties. None of the household servants were in sight. And she caught him by his cloak and said again, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and he ran out of the house. This is going to be the second time in the story of Joseph and his life that his cloak is going to get him into trouble through no fault of his own. Remember last week, if you were here, Jonathan walked us through chapter 37. And his brothers took this beautiful cloak that their father had given him because he was the favored son in this broken, dysfunctional family. And they used his cloak and dipped it in blood to mislead the father. And now it's going to happen again to Joseph. Because she grabs him by the cloak and he shrugs out of it and he flees. Centuries later, the Apostle Paul would sit down to write a letter to a new little church in a city of the Roman Empire called Corinth. We know it as 1 Corinthians. Corinth was a debauched city. It was a city that was given over to the pursuit of sexual pleasure. And whatever felt right, whatever your appetite was, whatever you felt like doing in Corinth, the message was, go for it. It was the Vegas of the ancient world. And Paul wrote to this little church that had grown up in this debauched, sexualized culture and city. And he said this, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18. Flee from sexual immorality. Flee from sexual immorality. If you are being tempted sexually, Paul said to them, just run. Turn your heel and flee. And I can't help wondering, as Paul is writing those exact words to the church in Corinth, whether this is the story he's got in mind. You can see it, can't you? He's thinking about Joseph shrugging out of that cloak and running out the door away from this woman who's trying to entice him. And Paul writes to this church in the midst of this sexualized culture and says, look, flee from sexual immorality. Just get out of there. I wonder how many of us need to hear that word today. I wonder how many of us in a romantic dating relationship who are being tempted to take it further than we should. And God in His Word says to you, flee sexual immorality. Or maybe you've been caught into the web of jumping onto the internet and looking at some kinds of images that get you stirred up but aren't helpful for your soul. And God in His Word says, flee from sexual immorality. Or there's a relationship at work with a colleague that's been fun and enjoyable but is turning flirtatious, and you know this could go to some dark, dangerous places, and the Word of God says, flee from that. We have got to take, in this sexualized culture that we are now in, aren't we? We have got to take the Word of God seriously on this. Flee all sexual immorality. And that's what Joseph does here in the story. He's a tremendous example of a young person, a young man who stands firm on purity and resists temptation. And he flees. But the tragedy of the story is this cloak that he leaves in this woman's hand, she then uses against him. And verses 13 to 15 tell us she calls the servants into the house who hadn't been in there. And she says, look at this cloak. That Hebrew slave that my husband brought, he just tried to rape me. And then she waits for her husband to come home, and she tells the same fable to him as well. And so the main part of the story ends this way in verses 19 and 20. When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, this is how your slave treated me, he burned with anger. And Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. See, Genesis chapter 39 is not just a story of sexual immorality. It's not just a story of resisting temptation and choosing to flee and run away. Genesis 39 has actually got a bigger narrative in mind. There's a bigger point going on. Genesis 39 is a story of injustice. It's a story of someone who was framed for something they never did. It's a story of someone who chooses to do the right thing and obey God, and then finds themselves in a worse position because of that. Genesis 39 is the story of someone who is unfairly imprisoned. It's a story of someone who is wronged. It's a story very similar to the Count of Monte Cristo and the story of another young man named Edmond Dantes. And the question that looms in the story is, where is God in the midst of this? Where's God in the midst of injustice? Where is God when a young man chooses to do what is right and resists temptation and ends up in prison for that? Where's God disappeared to? See, the way the story works, in fact, the way every story works, is that there's a basic plot to a narrative. It goes an introduction, and then there'll be three key moves in a story. There's the crisis of the story that will reach a climax and then will be resolved, and the story concludes. That's the way every fairy tale you've ever heard works. That's the way every novel works. That's the way every movie works. That's the basic plot line. And more complex stories and movies, they add more climaxes and more conflicts and crises, but that's how a story basically works. So in this story, the crisis is that this woman is trying to tempt Joseph to come to bed with her. And it builds to this climax where he continues to resist her temptation until he runs out the door, but then she falsely accuses him of rape, and so it resolves with him in prison. But what kind of resolution is that? In fact, when I drew this up I have a whiteboard in my office, and I kind of tried to draw up how's the story flowing, and I ended up with a question mark next to the word resolution. Because this isn't really a resolution at all, is it? One writer that I've been reading on the life of Joseph, Vodi Balcom, writes this: there it is, Joseph's reward for faithfulness and purity. Betrayal. Betrayal. We would expect Joseph's faithfulness to be rewarded with deliverance, but that is not the case. Instead of happily ever after, this story goes from frying pan to fire. So I want to suggest this morning, Genesis 39 is a story that challenges many of our assumptions about God. Many of us have an idea, a theology, that says if we do the right thing, if we obey what God has said in His Word, if we honour Him, then He'll look after us. He'll make things right. He'll deliver us when things go wrong. And we wouldn't maybe necessarily say it this way, but here's our thinking. If I honour God, if I obey God in my life, He's obligated to rescue me. He owes me. It's why often in our lives when things go wrong, when we face hardship and suffering, often our question is, where are you, God? Because this isn't fair. And the reason we feel like this isn't fair is because we operate with this idea. I've done my part, God, you owe me. See, many of us essentially hold to a Christian concept of karma. If I've honoured God, well, God's got to honour me. And in fact, it seems as though the Bible at times teaches that, doesn't it? For example, Hebrews chapter 6 verse 10 says, God is not unjust. He will not forget your work and the love you have shown Him as you have helped His people and continue to help Him. And that verse is absolutely true. God is a just God. God's a fair God. God is a God who's going to make things right, isn't He? And He is one day. One day when we reach the new heavens and the new earth, God is going to obliterate sin. God is going to right every wrong. God is going to sort it all out. God is going to vindicate His people. God is going to repay for all of the suffering and hardship we've endured. God is going to wipe away every tear, isn't He? Yes, He is. But that doesn't mean He's always going to do it here and now. It doesn't always mean He's going to step in and right it now. It doesn't mean He's going to listen to your prayers and always answer yes. He does at times. We cry for deliverance. We cry out for healing. We ask God to step in. And many times He does, doesn't He? But folks, there's also many times where He chooses not to. Because in the life of Joseph and in your life and in my life, there's a bigger story going on. And sometimes God's got bigger plans and different plans to what we have in mind. And sometimes when we are wronged, God may not make it right. In fact, that's the big idea of this story. When we are wronged, God may not make it right. Not right away, not in that moment. He may step in and fix it, but He may not as well. So you imagine what that looks like in your life and mine at times. Imagine, for example, if there was a young adult standing here in a romantic relationship, dating a boyfriend or girlfriend, deeply in love. But their boyfriend or girlfriend wants to take the relationship to another level. Feels like it's time they became sexually intimate. And so this Christian young adult says, no, I'm not doing that. God is clear in His Word, and I want to maintain my purity. I want to do the right thing, and I don't want to sin against God. And when the pressure doesn't crack them, then they get dumped. Their boyfriend or girlfriend decides to move on to someone else. And so this young adult who has done the right thing and honored God ends up alone, ends up unloved. Or take another example, take an employee of a company who notices that the way the company is making a profit these days, it's just doing a little bit of fraud. Nothing major, just a little bit here and there, just to make sure that the money's still coming in and they're staying ahead of their competitors. And the Christian employee says, I'm not willing to be part of that. That's not part of my ethics as a follower of Jesus. And the boss puts pressure on them, and their colleagues want them to kind of come on board and be part of this, and they refuse. And a couple of months later, when the company decides to restructure, guess whose name is at the top of the redundancy list? And so this person's done the right thing and honored God, and they find themselves in an unemployment queue, frantically looking for a job. Or take a third scenario of a person who's meeting friends for coffee and enjoying catching up and meeting together week after week until one day the conversation turns to someone else who isn't there. And they begin to assassinate that person's character, begin to gossip behind their back until this Christian sitting in the circle around the table says, guys, I'm not comfortable with this. This isn't a fair conversation. This isn't the right thing to do. Can we stop, please? And there's that uncomfortable silence where someone has spoken like that. And it leaves kind of awkwardly. And then that person finds they're not told about the next coffee gathering. And they hear a few months later that the rest of that group have been meeting for coffee without them. And they've done the right thing. But they end up being uninvited. This is life, isn't it? There are times where you and I choose to do the right thing, the God-honoring thing, the biblical thing. And sometimes in life we end up getting wronged for it. And while God at times might step in and might intervene and might vindicate us and might answer our prayers with an immediate yes, often he does not. But what the story of Joseph teaches us, what Genesis 39 tells us, is that when we are wronged, God may not make it right, but he is always with us. He's always with us. And that's what this story is designed to teach. See, if you just read the middle chunk of the story where the main action happens, the crisis and the climax and the resolution, you just get this sad story of a young man trying to do the right thing and honor God and ending up in prison. But the introduction and the conclusion to this story, the bookends to this story, they're where the real theology is taught in this particular chapter of the Bible. So if you've got a Bible with you, look with me at the introduction and conclusion. If not, have a look at the screen. I want to read you some of the words that introduce the story and then close it. Genesis 39, verse 2. It begins, the Lord, in most of our English Bibles, which in capital letters indicates God's name, Yahweh. And so on the screens and on the screen if you're online, I've changed that to Yahweh. And I'm going to do that each time the Lord comes up in the text. So Yahweh was with Joseph, verse 2, so that he prospered. And he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. And when his master saw that Yahweh was with him, and that Yahweh gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. And Potiphar put him in charge of his household and entrusted everything to his care. And then the story ends this way, verse 20. But while Joseph was in prison, Yahweh was with him. He showed him kindness. He granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. And so the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison. And he was made responsible for all that was done there. And the warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because Yahweh was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Did you hear the words? Did you hear what was repeated? 7 times in the intro and the conclusion, 5 times at the beginning, twice at the end is the divine name Yahweh. And why that's significant is because in the whole Joseph story, from Genesis 37 all the way through to Genesis 50, God's name Yahweh will be used 8 times in total. 7 of the 8 are in this story, in the bookends. And did you hear the refrain 4 times? Twice in the introduction, twice in the conclusion. Yahweh was with him. Yahweh was with him. Yahweh was with him. Yahweh was with him. And that's the message of Genesis 39. When we are wronged, God may or may not make it right, but He is always with us. And that's the message that you and I are to take away today. When we are wronged in life, when we do the right thing and end up alone at the end of a romantic relationship, when we do the right thing and end up being made redundant more because of our beliefs than our work performance, when we do the right thing and end up uninvited with friends, when we are wronged in life, God may or may not make it right, but He is always, always, always with us. He is with you. If you've ever felt the pain of being uninvited, He's with you in that pain. If you've ever known the anguish of being made redundant or unemployed, He's with you in that. If you've ever lost someone's love or been left alone, He is with you. And whether we're standing in an unemployment line, whether sitting at a coffee table alone, whether we're sitting in a cancer ward in a hospital or at the graveside of a loved one, if you are a follower of Jesus, hear the word of God. He is with you. He is with you. He is always, forever with you. And the coming of Jesus simply underlines that even more. Because Jesus has come, we now read Genesis 39 as followers of Christ, don't we? We have the added dimension of the coming and the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus to underline it all. Because when the prophet Isaiah predicted that Jesus would come centuries before he did, he said, a virgin will conceive and give birth to a child, and you are to name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. The coming of Jesus, where God becomes a human being and steps into a broken, wrongful world, is the final underlining of the point of Genesis 13. In our pain, when we're wronged, whether or not God makes it right now, He's with us. And there are some of you here today, and some of you watching online, and the pain is deep, and the questions are huge, and the tears are real. And He wants you to hear today from the story that bookends the life of Joseph and bookends the life of Brad and bookends your life. He is with you. He is with you. No matter what you face, no matter how often you've been wronged, no matter what you're dealing with right now, He is with you. In a few moments, we're going to celebrate communion together. As the band comes back, we're going to have the opportunity, as Jesus invited us to do here, to take bread and juice and remember Him. And online, you're welcome to do this at home if you choose to as well. And I want to invite you today, as you take the emblems that Jesus gave us of His body and His blood, I want to invite you to take those little tokens and hold on to them for a minute as a tangible symbol and reminder again. He is with you right here, right now, no matter what you're facing. He's here. And He'll never leave you. At the end of His ministry on earth, Jesus, at the end of Matthew's Gospel, gives the Great Commission, go into all the world and take this message. And what does He say at the end of that? Having commissioned His disciples, I will be with you always, to the very end of the age. The writer to the Hebrews says, never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. See, the reality is that there are two possible outcomes in Genesis 39, deliverance and presence. If push came to shove and God said, which would you like when you're in pain? Most of us would say, I'll take deliverance. Get me out of this, God. But the message of Genesis 39 is he may or he may not. But for God, the greater gift is his presence. He's with you. Whether he steps in now or not, whether he says an immediate yes or not, whether he answers your prayers right now the way you want or not, whether he rights the wrong today or not, he is with you. He is with you. He is with you. And he will never, ever let you go. So Jesus, help us to cling to this today. Help us to grasp this message that is so beautifully underlined in your very name, Emmanuel. God is with us. And for those of us sitting here today, those of us online who are facing wrong, who have been deeply hurt, who are just facing really hard times, help us to understand and to hear from your word this promise that echoes from beginning to end. You are with us. One day you're going to make it right. In the meantime, would you help us understand the wonder of this promise that no matter what, you are with us.